Nutrient cycles and ecosystems. In this section, we're going to look at a few different nutrient cycles, specifically the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. And these are important to living things. And it turns out that they do cycle through the environment. Okay, there are 5 chemical elements required for life. They're carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And they cycle through the environment. Let's take a look at the carbon cycle. Carbon is the fundamental unit in cells and all living things. It's an essential part of chemical reactions that sustain life. So we find carbon in our environment in a number of different sort of forms. Carbon is stored in what we call carbon sinks, and anything that's a sink is just a place where a material is stored for a long period of time. It's not generally cycling for a period of time. Carbon can be stored for long periods of time, but it can also be stored for short periods of time, and so some of the sinks are not as long lasting. Short-term storage of carbon is in plants, animals, and decaying organic matter in the soil, and as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and dissolved in the top layers of ocean. So we'd see, some carbon in all these living things, as well as dissolved in the top layers of the ocean. So this little layer right here, we've got a fair amount of carbon. And also in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So with these short-term storage locations for carbon, the carbon doesn't stay in these locations for very long because it's going to move on to other locations. Longer-term storage of carbon is accomplished as carbon dioxide dissolved in the middle and lower layers of the ocean. Okay, and in coal, which we don't have a picture of this, but the coal would be, associated with the rocks. The coal and oil and gas that would be deep down underneath the layers of the soil and the earth, several hundred feet down. And of course that material, those fossil fuels, were formed many years ago, millions of years ago, by dead and decaying matter that eventually was chemically converted into what we call the fossil fuels. You'd also find longer-term storage of carbon in ocean sediments, so down at the bottom of the ocean, and this is from dead and decaying matter that turns into rock, or from shells of marine organisms that are made of calcium carbonate, and when they die, their shells fall to the ocean, or they are on the ocean floor, and they eventually get worn away through some weathering and movement of the water. They get ground up, and the calcium carbonate ends up being incorporated into the sediments, and so the carbon sort of gets stuck there for long periods of time. So there's 2 types of carbon storage then. There's the kind that's short-term and longer-term carbon storage. Carbon does cycle, as the image indicates. We have photosynthesis, which occurs in plants and cyanobacteria and algae, so it might be happening anywhere where you see this green plants, and also a lot of it is occurring in the water where you have algae. What's happening here through the process of photosynthesis is that carbon dioxide and water are reacting to form glucose and oxygen, and for that, of course, we need light energy. Okay, so light is kind of what makes it possible for the plants to convert the carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. And as we mentioned in the previous video, we know that cellular respiration occurs when these primary producers that are doing photosynthesis get eaten by the primary consumers, like the cows in this picture that are eating the grass. They do cellular respiration in their bodies, where the carbohydrate glucose is then broken down into cellular energy called ATP, and this is through the process of cellular respiration. On your sheet it just says energy, but it actually should say ATP. Carbon is also involved in decomposition. The decomposers, like the bacteria, break down large quantities of cellulose, and cellulose is a carbohydrate that contains carbon, of course, but it's not something that's easily digested by most animals, and so if the bacteria weren't there to break it down, it would basically not rot and the carbon would not be returned back into the ecosystem. So you have this fallen tree here. If it wasn't for bacteria, the carbon that's in that tree would be locked in that tree forever, but the bacteria and the fungi, the decomposers, can actually break it down so that that carbon goes back into the soil and then can be recycled in the carbon cycle. We also have ocean processes where carbon dioxide dissolves in cold northern waters and sinks, and the ocean currents carry it to the tropics where the water rises and releases carbon dioxide. And this is called ocean mixing, so the carbon is cycling through the ocean as well. And finally, you got another little picture here that's a little thing that's not shown in the picture, but we'll just make this into a volcano. Volcanic eruptions also release carbon dioxide, as do forest fires. So we'll put some flames over here to show the forest fires. Okay, so carbon is constantly moving through the environment, and one picture really is worth 1,000 words. You should be able to have a look at this picture and sort of be able to explain a fair amount about the carbon cycle, where you would find carbon, and list some examples of how carbon moves from one location to the other. Humans influence the carbon cycle as well. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have increased carbon dioxide levels by 30% due to burning of fossil fuels, both in factories and also in cars and other vehicles. And part of the problem is that carbon is being removed from long-term storage, like these oil deposits and the coal deposits, much more quickly than it naturally would be. So it's kind of tipping the balance of the carbon cycle. Another thing that's contributing to the problem is the clearing of forests for agricultural use, and what that does is it removes the carbon from all those trees and forests, and it reduces the number of plants that can absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sort of recycle it, doing cellular respiration to give us more oxygen. Okay, so that's a kind of a brief summary of the carbon cycle. In the next video, we'll take a look at the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle.